Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Ximena, welcome to the podcast. It's so good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you've done an awful lot with your life. One of those really eclectic biographies, which I always find interesting. So you've been at LinkedIn, Pinterest, and Twitter. Not a whole lot of people can claim that. What were some top lessons you learned working at these startups so far?
I think the big thing for me working in those environments was realizing just how very much relationships matter. I think particularly in the beginning of your career, there's a sort of focus on efficiency and getting things done. And it can feel like the way to do that is by going it alone, kind of taking control. And even frankly, as a new leader, it can sometimes feel like that. Like, I have to do this myself in order for it to get done. But really, those experiences have just taught me that you can't go it alone. You need other people in order to see your vision through. And that really requires building relationships, because that's what's going to allow you to make that impact, to get the resources you're looking for, to influence the change that you're hoping to see, to drive the strategy in a certain direction. You need to build those relationships so that people believe in that vision and want to join you in it.
Well, it's interesting because one of the patterns in Silicon Valley, and this is almost a rule with some investors, like I think it's a Reid Hoffman rule, it may be a Paul Graham rule, but like you don't just start something solo, you have to find a co-founder. And that whole idea of partnership is built right in. Any thoughts on that, like co-founding and teams? Because you have a lot of young entrepreneurs listening, and outside of Silicon Valley, a lot of stuff's a solo show, right? Like I've probably fallen into that trap before where I build a team, but I don't found things together. Anything more on the whole co-founder partner idea?
I think part of that, particularly in Silicon Valley, is there's a really strong desire to have someone who's exclusively focused on the technical aspect, and then someone who can bring in the business side of things. And it's somewhat unusual to get someone who is frankly skilled at and passionate about both of those things. So I think that's part of it. But also, I mean, of course, it helps to have another person to toss ideas around with, to brainstorm with. I think particularly when you're thinking about building new products, experiences that might not exist. Some of those early ideas come from things that one individual is really excited about. And just having one other voice say like, hey, yeah, I think that might be a niche problem, or I think that might not be applicable to, most Americans. Having another voice to expand the view a little bit, I think can be really, really helpful.
So one of your roles has been user researcher. So I think a lot of us, we've heard of user interface, et cetera. What is a user researcher?
Yes. So a user researcher, I think of it as one of the most people-centric jobs in tech, because my job is really to understand people. So we call them users when they're using the platform in some way, but it could also be non-users, everyday people who, might someday want to use a particular app or website. And really, it's about understanding people's routines, their habits, their needs, their motivations, their perceptions of our brand, of maybe a competitor's brand, of our suite of products, competitor's suite of products. And it's all about understanding the psychology of people and what makes them tick in order to build something that really matters and that will really be used and that is meeting a need, like a real one, not what I was talking about earlier, where it's kind of a neat idea, but there's no core need that's being met there.
So this is a little bit different if I'm understanding right. And you have a great book, by the way, but if I understand correct, This is more than, I bought a t-shirt and now it's like, how would you rate our company? Or it's not like that 5-star, 3-star, 2-star, any other feedback, not like you get from the airlines, because you get a lot of leaders who are saying, well, I do surveys, right? So I send surveys out to my congregation, to my readers, to my clients, to my customers, and I talk to them all the time. Is this different than that? And how so, if it is?
So surveys are certainly part of what a user researcher might do. It's one of the many tools they might use.
Okay.
My specialty is more on the qualitative side, where we're really having one-on-one conversations, or we're having a workshop, a group conversation. I might run a diary study and ask someone to track their, let's say, meal planning habits over the course of a month, and then do a deep dive with them to really understand those routines. So it's not strictly and again, my specialty is more on the conversational side of things. But the key really is that, I think surveys sometimes are used at the end. It's like, I've given you this experience, now tell me what you thought. User research can be used at the end to evaluate an experience, which is what those surveys do. But it can also be used at the very beginning. So before you even know that you want to create merch, to design a t-shirt, you might conduct research to find out, how do people decide what their personal style is, and what is their connection with particular brands? Like, how is their identity reflected in what they wear? That's a super different set of questions than, did the shirt fit? Did you like it? Was the cut good? Right? And it's going to inform upfront the kind of work, the kind of products you pursue and put out in the world.
Okay, so what you are suggesting is just so different than a lot of the entrepreneurs that I know, because they have this business idea, they have this web service they want to provide, they have a restaurant they want to build, and they have the menu in their head, or they're launching a church and they got the idea of exactly how the church should be. And so they're out there in the world, but what you're saying is, no, you should listen before you launch. Is it more like that? Like, you got to figure out what the market needs? Can you explain more about that? Because I think that's a very different paradigm than a lot of visionaries would normally stumble into on their own.
Yeah, so the beauty of user research is that it can be used at any phase of the process. So it can be used early, it can be used in the middle, it can be used to evaluate or validate the idea at the end. But where I think it has the most power is at the beginning, before you get started. So it's before you hire a software development team to go build out your app, or it's before you build out this big team to bring your vision into fruition. It's great to have an initial vision, like, absolutely, right? That's the seed, but that's just the beginning. And so you have to be able to spend some time up front to figure out, are you going to be able to be growing that seed in the right space? Is there an environment that's going to be conducive to this? Meaning, are there people who need what you want to offer, and not want it, but like really need it? And if so, how does it fit into their worlds? And what does it compete with in their worlds, right? If you think about our day-to-day, I think we all know time is a super scarce resource. Yeah. So whatever it is you're introducing into the world is going to take up someone's time. That's not a bad thing, but you're competing with all of the other things they could be doing with their time at any given moment. And so you really need to make sure that you know that, and you know what you're up against. And in particular, I think it can be easy to say, well, I'm going to launch the next, let's say, Facebook. So my competitor is Facebook. Well, okay, yes, maybe. But who else is your competitor? Well, it's TikTok, it's Twitter, it's LinkedIn, it's email, it's work, it's Slack, right? There's so many other, it's hobbies. There's so many other elements. And so really, I think the power of bringing user research in up front is that you're getting a better picture of not just what you're up against, but where you fit in. Where do you fit into someone's life?
Do you think, and I mean, this is probably not an easily answerable question, but there is a stat that 70% of all businesses fail in the first few years, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think some of that might in some way be related to a lack of listening? This big, bold idea that nobody wants?
Yes, I do. I think that, again, kind of going back to what I was mentioning earlier in terms of building relationships, there are these actions that we take as we're building out products or companies. And they feel like the most important ones, right? It's like, well, I'm going to design my brand. I'm going to get that website up. I'm going to, claim the domain, right? But those are things that we can do fairly efficiently, fairly quickly, independently. But again, we actually have to slow down and talk to people and listen to them and get a sense of what the real opportunity is, not the, everything's roses opportunity in our head, which any entrepreneur, any small business owner needs that. And that is so important because that is the drive, right, for you to build this thing and put it out in the world. And that's the motivation that's going to keep you motivated when things get hard. So it's not a knock on that. It's just to say that that's the start. And if you can invest more in broadening that points of view, it's better for you to find out that there may be stumbling blocks upfront rather than invest time, energy, money, and then realize, nobody's interested in our fusion menu option that I thought was really cool, but it turns out people don't want to eat that, right? So I think it's about doing that investigation up front to inform your path forward.
That's really good to know. Can you give me an example from your time at Twitter, Pinterest, and LinkedIn, where user feedback either shaped the initial product when it was launched or has shaped multiple iterations? Because I think we've all seen as users of those that like Pinterest today is not Pinterest of 5 years ago. LinkedIn today has totally morphed. Twitter, famously said 140 characters. Now they're not 140 characters anymore. They're pivoting all the time. So can you give us some real life examples of how user research has shaped the products that we use?
Yeah, sure. And I think even the examples you've given are perfect examples of when a researcher was probably involved. So that shift from 140 characters to more, they definitely put that in front of users to get a sense of, what they thought and how they might
what are your pain points
differently. Yeah, exactly. But one concrete example I can give, you were mentioning how Pinterest, for instance, has evolved. And I worked on an initiative many years ago to look at meal planning. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, where I was trying to understand, how do people meal plan? How do they cook? What are their cooking routines? And at the time, so if you're on Pinterest today, you know that when you look at a recipe, you can rate a recipe. You can give it 5 stars, you can give it 2 stars. You can leave a comment and say, I really love this cookie recipe, but I doubled the sugar because I have a really strong sweet tooth and I thought it needed it, right? So, you get this sort of community chiming in and weighing in and saying, oh, don't use olive oil, use this, whatever it may be. Several years ago, that did not exist. So pins that had recipes were just that. They had recipes. There wasn't that much information. And in fact, you had to kind of scroll through often food bloggers, right? Where they're kind of saying like, it's a Saturday morning and I was really inspired and I wanted to bake brunch. And so, story. And then there's the recipe buried at the end. So all of those things have since changed, where now you've got ratings, you've got reviews, you've got the recipe pulled out much clearer. You can filter by ingredient lists. You can filter by, how much time does a recipe take to cook? And that was the result of this research, where we knew that there was an opportunity to improve the experience in this space for anyone who came to Pinterest with an interest in cooking or baking. But the research that we conducted helped inform what the set of changes should be and how they should be prioritized, how they should be sequenced, et cetera. And in terms of the process and the sort of behind the scenes that, got us from point A to point B, it basically involved me talking to a lot of people and going into their kitchens. And I scheduled
literally going to their houses.
Going to their houses. Yeah. So I did a diary study where I had them track, for 2 weeks. Anytime you're thinking about meal planning, like answer these questions or take a photo of, the recipe so that I could get a sense of how are people navigating their kitchens? What kind of apps are they using? I'm interested in Pinterest, but I'm also interested in All Recipes and Food Network and the back of the pasta box, whatever you use, right? Your your great grandmother's recipe card. I'm here for it all, right? Because I just want to understand the bigger picture. And then from that, I had these deeper dive one-on-one conversations where I went to people's kitchens and we scheduled time together where I could ask them questions. And then I also observed them in the kitchen. And so I could see exactly how they were making recipes, and how they were cooking and what else was going on in their world. Because it's not enough to just, ask someone, oh yeah, what is cooking like for you? You're going to get some version of the answer. But if I'm there in your kitchen and I see your 6-year-old running around in the background, or your 8-year-old wants to help you cut, the mushrooms, and your spouse just got home in the middle of your cooking and now you're going to hand off, like that tells me so much more about what you need in that moment, not what you want, but what you need in that moment. And that is what helps, that those insights are really what help create a better experience for anyone who needs product.
When you say it out loud, it just makes so much more sense. Like, it makes so much sense. And yet I think 99% of people never do that, right? Like, we want this to be read in the kitchen, but I will never go to a kitchen. We want this to reach a certain group, but I'll never talk to that group. I guess my question is, how does what you're observing, like grandma's recipe, the 6-year-old, the dull knife, impact Pinterest as an app? Do you know what I mean? Like, where is the cause and effect? So how do you then modify your product so that it helps the woman with 3 toddlers running around and a dull kitchen knife and grandma's recipe stuck to the cupboard? And while she's trying to listen to Alexa, give her the recipe list one more time, the ingredient list one more time. How does that impact your app?
Yeah. So, the outcome of studies like this is that you walk away with a set of insights or learnings where you say, here's what I've learned. These are the patterns that I'm seeing. These are the needs that I'm seeing people have. This is the context of their world. And then you also provide recommendations. So you say, based on what I know about our set of features, and where our special sauce is, what we're good at as a company, what our mission is as a company. Here are the, top 5 things I think we should focus on. You can't focus on everything, right? There's always going to be more than you can do. And so you take the first stab at saying, okay, given this framework, which is Pinterest as a company, and we're trying to inspire people to do things in real life, we're not that interested in keeping them on the platform. We want you to go bake the cookies. Like, we don't want you to just save the cookie recipes, right? So then that's going to dictate, my takeaways, which is, hey, okay, here are the areas that I think we should focus on.
Highlight the recipe, right? Don't give me the whole narrative.
Exactly. Or, I don't think we need to work on an Alexa integration right now because that's not essential for most people in the country. They're not using it that way, right? Or I do think we need to lean into that because of XYZ. So, those are, you're synthesizing these insights and using your understanding of the company and the product and the opportunity to prioritize recommendations, which, once you do that, there's a whole other phase, which is the negotiation phase with your team, where you go back and forth and decide, do we want to do that? If so, how and when?
Well, that was my next question. I think, and this is probably a little bit of projection from my own time in leadership, but sometimes I'm afraid to ask people what they think because I'm afraid it's going to take me off mission. How do you sort out the feedback, the raw feedback you're getting, which is probably a mixture of great ideas and bad ideas? And how do you decide? How do you go through that filter process about what to pay attention to and what to ignore?
I think step 1 is really figuring out we call it study design, but essentially, what is the data you're going to be gathering? Who is it from? There's this idea of garbage in, garbage out. So if if I had done that study and only visited houses in San Francisco, I would have gotten very, very different insights than what I ended up doing, which was I flew to Chicago and I went to the Midwest and I got that perspective as a counter to the perspective that we already had in San Francisco. And there were many reasons to do that, right? But so the first thing is you really have to make sure that you're talking to the right people and that you're gathering the right data, because it's called your sample. If your sample is skewed, if your sample is biased, well, then so is your data, right?
Well, and that's interesting because a Louisiana kitchen is very different than maybe a Midwest kitchen is different than a Boston kitchen is different than a California kitchen, right? So how do you decide? Because I'm sure there are Pinterest users in every state. Let's break that down. How do you figure that out?
Yeah. So, part of it is, we did go broad with the diary studies. So that was across the board national. So we had a national view from there. Part of it is also figuring out, okay, who is my sort of like ideal customer or who is my, another way to think about it is who's my most loyal customer or who is, using this set of features the most. There's different ways that you can kind of segment and then decide, I'm going to get the most bang for my buck by talking to people who really love food, as opposed to talking to people who, occasionally look at food things, but like they really love fashion is the thing that they love the most, right? So part of it is just being strategic about, okay, you can talk to everybody and that'll give you one view. But then also the area that you're trying to really move the needle on, well, that's the area that, you need to make sure that the people you're talking to are either invested in that because they're going to be most enthusiastic about it, right, or open to it. And this is one of the big challenges, I think, with running any research study is you have to get that recruit right, because if not, the data's useless.
Okay, that's good. But no, that's super helpful for me because I've always been a little bit wary of just asking everybody what they think. But I think, narrowing your target a little bit, the people you're trying to reach, the customer you're trying to keep, or the customer you're trying to attract, that makes a lot of sense. And then I love it seems to be a best practice, Ximena, from a lot of CEOs, particularly, this is not statistical, but a lot of female CEOs will spend time on the line. Spend time, you listen to Sarah Blakely. A lot of male CEOs often are sitting behind a desk somewhere in meetings and boardrooms. But I noticed that as a tendency, this is just anecdotal, but like some of the very best will go out into the field and will spend their time listening as much as directing. And that's kind of what your book's about. It's about listening, right? You dedicated your book, Listen Like You Mean It, to your parents. What did you learn from your parents about listening rather?
So I grew up, I'm one of 4 girls. So we had a lively, active household. There was always something going on between the 4 of us. And I remember, I think some people could find that chaotic to a certain degree of like, there's never any space for me to, have time to myself or, just be alone or whatever it may be. But I remember really loving it so much so that when I went to college, I requested my freshman year, I wanted to be in a suite. I did not want a single. I was like, I don't know what will happen if I have my own place. So I really loved it. And I think that, it would have been really easy for me to feel unheard or ignored or left out in that environment when there is so much happening. Like that could have been an outcome. And I really credit my parents with this is I never felt that way. I always felt like, yeah, there was always a lot going on and we were all to some degree distracted at any given moment. But when you sat down with them and, needed to connect with them, they were there and they were present and like any of those concerns just sort of like washed away. And I think it's because they were really good at making space, even in a crowded, household, making space for each of us, and really deeply listening to whatever it was that was on our minds.
What are some of the listening mistakes you see people make?
I think the biggest one is that we often think that we're listening when we're not. Many times we think, okay, we're here with the other person, I'm picking up what they're putting down, but instead of really deeply listening, we are at the same time winding up a response. So we're getting ready to say something. We've got a question that we want to ask and follow up with, or we have a brilliant idea that we are just so excited to share. Or we think that what the other person is saying is boring and we want to change the subject, right? There's a lot of reasons, but often in that process of, queuing up our response, that means we're not listening anymore. We are listening to our own inner monologue as opposed to what the other person is saying. So I think that's a really big one.
Can you train that out of yourself? Because I was reading that, and as you're describing that, I'm like, yeah, that's me. And I'm trying to get a lot better at listening, but like sometimes it's really hard not to have the next question or to change the subject. So like, is that something you can train yourself out of, or what is that?
It's very common, and it's very human. It's sort of it's the sort of blessing and the curse of like having this amazing brain that can process things so quickly. But you can work on that. I think, ways to work on that are building awareness of it. So as your thoughts come into the picture, just labeling them as thoughts and saying, oh, I'm noticing that I'm getting distracted here. I'm noticing that I want to chime in. Just noticing that and letting it go, right? That's a very meditative exercise. So building some mindfulness around it, I think is one thing that you can do to sort of identify it, see it,
self-awareness.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. And then the other thing I would say is, oftentimes we build up, what we want to say next, in part because there's a fear that if we don't say it right now, we're going to lose it. Whatever it is, right? It's like we want to hold on to this idea. We really want to share it. And so it starts to crowd everything else out. But what you find when you start to let that go and just loosen the grip a little bit on that is that if it's really important, it's going to come back to you. Like that's the way your memory works, is the really important things will come back. And so when you start to trust that process and let it do its thing, it becomes easier to say, oh, there's a thought that I'm holding on to. I don't need to hold on to that. If it's important, it's going to come back. And if not, it wasn't that important. So I can just be here now.
Can we talk about interruptions? I have found myself, I have been on a multi-decade journey from learning how to not interrupt people, because I always feel I have something to say. And honestly, it's a challenge. 450 episodes into this podcast, I'm trying to get better at not interrupting. What is the problem with interruption, and how do you get over it?
The big problem with interrupting is that you lose out on what the other person was going to say. Some people will never recover from being interrupted. You interrupt them and that's it. Wherever their train of thought was going, it's been shut down. Or they may be unwilling to go back, or they may just forget. But so I think the biggest risk is that, especially if you're trying to get to know someone or understand them better, you kind of had an in and now that door is closed. So I think one thing that you can try when it comes to interrupting, and I can really relate also to what you said of trying to work on this, because this is my sort of Achilles heel, being patient in that way. But one thing you can do is just to count to 10, in your head, just wait it out. And think about what can I glean through observation rather than interrupting. Like when I was talking about those cook-alongs with you earlier, there were many to chime in and ask, oh, why did you use that pasta box recipe? Or, oh, why did you pulled out your iPad? What for? Right. But if I had done that, I would have stopped them from sharing, either verbally or non-verbally, just through their actions and behaviors, from sharing with me, what their actual routine and process was. And I might have made them nervous by asking them that, by interrupting in that way. And so I think we sometimes don't realize that when we interrupt, we lose out on what can come next. And we can also make the other person uncomfortable in some way, especially if there are cultural differences, right? In terms of, you and I might think interrupting is a sign of enthusiasm. We're so excited. We want to just chime in. And someone else might feel really disrespected by that and be like, wow, I thought we had a different relationship. I'm not sure what's going on here.
A recurring question on my podcast, probably because it's an observation and a bit of a pet peeve, is my perception is that we're not as good at listening to each other as we were perhaps 10 or 20 years ago. That a lot of dialogue isn't really dialogue. It's me telling you what I think. It's my download. There's no question. There's no interaction. And then you tell me what you think. Again, no question, no interaction, just a dump. Have you seen that? Is that something you've identified? Like, is the art of conversation dying? I'm curious for your take on that.
I think it's certainly under strain,
Mm.
given given a lot. I think I don't love the argument of like technology is destroying everything, right?
Yeah,
Like this
sure.
is all technology's fault. I actually think that the challenges that we have with listening have been there for a long time. Technology maybe exacerbates some of those or gives us new ways to undermine our listening skills.
Mm.
But it's a pretty, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about here, they're pretty human instincts, right? Of like interrupting or winding up to say what you want to say next, or you wanting to share a story, and not being able to wait somebody else's story out. Like those are very human impulses. I think that technology has certainly, reinforced those impulses to a certain
Right.
degree. And it has for sure changed how we communicate with each other. And there's research that even just having a phone out on the table while we're having a conversation decreases your ability to be empathetic, right? So certainly all of that is part of the picture. But I think because there is such this like human element to it, that's actually what gives me hope that, listening is under strain, but we kind of have what we need in order to regain it. We just have to do a little bit of that inward self-reflection, thinking of what we're trying to do, what we're trying to get out of these relationships, but some intentionality behind it. And that's what, I'm hoping to do with the book is sort of resurface this lost art that I think many of us can intuitively connect with. We just kind of need a little bit of a nudge.
Yeah, in leading people, you pointed out something I found really helpful that, and I work with some pollsters on some projects on a pretty close basis. And one of the problems is self-reporting. So I say I'm in great shape, but I can't really run a mile. I say, oh, I eat super healthy. And, as soon as we're done this call, open a bag of Doritos, but they don't really count, right? So I drink one glass of wine, but it's actually three. You give some examples in the book. How do you get through that to really listen well enough? And the way that shows up in leadership is, how are you doing today, Ximena? And you're like, I'm great. Meanwhile, you're crumbling inside. And I'm like, no, Jimena's great. She's awesome. Like, let's move on. Right. How do you learn to train yourself so that you can actually see how people are really doing?
Well, I think you started talking about it just now in terms of seeing how people are really doing. So it's not
Mm,
just hearing what they're saying, but it's observing them as well.
okay.
Right. So you're bringing in the listening elements of, trying to listen for not just the literal, what's being said, but also the subtext, the meaning, maybe
Mm,
what's not being said. That's something to pay attention to. The emotion behind what is being shared. You're listening to all those things, but then you're also observing and you're paying attention to what is the tone of voice, what is the pitch or pacing that is happening as this person is communicating. What is their posture like? These nonverbal gestures can tell us a lot about a person and how they're really feeling. So if they're like, yeah, everything's fine, but they won't make eye contact with you, okay, what might that mean? Or if someone is, you're talking about pairing a set of teammates on a project and you're like, yeah, this is going to be so good. It's going to be such a fun collaboration for you. And you notice that they start to kind of pull away from the table, right? Or lean back or start to speak really slowly or really quickly, right? If there's some sort of shift there, those are all cues that there might be more that needs to be said.
So when you see that kind of, I don't know what you call it, cognitive dissonance, but that disconnect between what people are saying and what you think might be happening, what are some good ways to get under that without being like, are you lying to me? Like how do you like, the 3 glasses of wine is a great idea. Someone, let's say you're a doctor or whatever, and you're like, really 1 glass of wine? And, but you kind of suspect it's 3 because you've run the blood work and everything like that. Like, a lot of people are very afraid to sort of challenge the surface answers. So any strategies on how to do that?
Yeah, I think there's a few. One, in the case of something like lying to your doctor or misrepresenting the truth to your doctor. Yes. I think this is why what you'll probably find is that a lot of doctors look at your routine more broadly. So they ask about, your exercise, your diet, all of these other things that it's not specifically about like, hey, I think you're lying about the glass of wine. Let's go back to that. It's like, okay, like tell me how does this fit into everything else that you do? And what's a normal day look like for you? Okay. And is this, what kinds of settings does this occur in? That kind of thing, right? They go a little bit broader, frankly, in part, I think, to not push us away or make us feel caught in any way. I think in a work setting, when you're trying to suss that out, going bigger certainly helps, but also you can sometimes sense when someone has something more to say, and they might give you little openings if you're paying attention. And so I like to follow up on those with really gentle nudges because I don't want to push anyone too far, but those gentle nudges sound like, tell me more about that. If someone says, oh yeah, I think I could work with that person. Yeah, I think so. Where they're kind of like
convincing themselves in the moment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd be like, oh, say more. Just tell me more about that. Or if someone says, well, I think that'll be an interesting challenge, but I'm up for it, right? And you could just say, oh, and that's because ... You're just teeing them up to say, well, because blah 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 blah, right? And so they're very small nudges, and that's why they're effective, is because you're cracking the door open just a little bit and letting them kind of go at their own pace by asking questions like, oh, what else? Or tell me more.
Yeah. What are the advantages to better listening? Like for a leader who is like, okay, I get it. But what is the payoff?
Well, I think the payoff is you're building much better relationships. You're collaborating better. I think you're able to align more quickly on goals. And ultimately, you're going to produce better work, right? If you know how someone, if you know what someone is motivated by, right? If you're managing somebody and oh, they're really motivated by public recognition. They actually don't care that much about money, whatever it may be, right? That's super useful information for you as a leader to figure out, okay, how do I set them up with the right opportunities, help them grow, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same idea. It's just that you're doing it in a way where you're understanding, well, what makes this person tick? Like I am, through listening, able to learn more about you as an individual or about this group and their group dynamics. And the more I can spot up front, the more effective our one-on-ones are going to be, our team projects are going to be, the more belonging people are going to feel within your organization, which I think is not to be underestimated. So I just think it's a sort of quiet superpower that it really, really boosts your relationships in a way that just can open up so much in the workplace and at home.
So sometimes you get into a conversation, you feel like you're listening, but it stayed fairly shallow. How do you have deeper conversations? What are some keys? And this is true in life, but also in leadership. I love deep conversations. Like, they're my favorite ones. So how do you go there?
I think part of it is reframing or revising some of the questions that we ask. So sometimes we think that we're asking good questions that are going to lead to a deeper conversation, but they're actually not that great. And so we often ask questions that are leading in some way where we kind of want to hear a certain thing. And so we lead someone to give us a certain answer, or they're biased in some way. And if we can shift our questions to be more open-ended, that makes a big difference. So even, let's say you're asking someone, hey, are you worried about that big deadline coming up for that project that you're working on? In that question, you've baked in the idea, intentionally or not, you've baked in the idea that this person has reason to be worried about this big deadline, right? Like that either the project is so big, they should be worried, or they're running out of time, they should be worried, or they're in over their heads, they should be worried, right? Like, and the other person, maybe is going to read into that and be like, whoa, should I be worried? Or even if they don't, which I think is the best case scenario, is they don't really hear all the subtext. They give you a yes or no answer. You say, no, I'm not worried. Or, yeah, I'm kind of worried, right? If we ask questions instead of starting with, are or is or do, if we shift those questions to beginning with how or what. So how are you feeling about that deadline coming up? What do you think about that?
Much more open-ended.
It's much more open-ended. And so then you give the other person the opportunity to step in and say, well, I'm a little bit nervous because of XYZ, but overall I'm feeling okay about it, whatever it may be. And that changes the nature of your conversations when you're able to shift your questions in that way.
How does silence play a role in a conversation?
Silence is crucial in conversation, but we are so uncomfortable with it that we often don't let it shine and do what it needs to do. So silence in conversation, I think many of us have the reaction of, oh my gosh, I've bored the other person. Like they have nothing to say in response, or I've alienated them in some way. Or we just have no chemistry, like, oh, it's going to be terrible reporting to this person. They don't get me. You can go a lot of places with silence. But silence doesn't have to have that sort of negative connotation. And in fact, I think there's a lot of good that comes from silence, which is that you give people the space to process, to think, to gear up for sharing something, especially if you're trying to go deep, right? Sometimes people have heard your question and they're still working on it, or they've heard, your assessment of a situation and they're pondering that, and they're thinking about, well, how am I going to respond? Like, how do I share my opinion? And so I think we really need to be a little more comfortable with this idea of silence and let it work for us rather than against us. Because often what happens is at the edge of silence, there's an insight. There's something really valuable to learn. But because we get so uncomfortable, we shift gears, we change the topic, we end the conversation. We don't get there because we are trying to ease our own discomfort rather than just saying, oh, this is a little awkward, but I think there might be more here to say.
Yeah, that's really true. I find even in interviewing, sometimes it looks like a guest will be ramping down with the question. And I'll just kind of leave it there. And then they drop something that's pure gold. I'm trying to implement that more and more in my life. Okay, so we're listening. We're not interrupting. We're allowing silence to happen. We're letting the other person speak. How do you not end up in a open, rambling conversation that goes nowhere? Like, can you guide it? Is it just, no, I let the other person drive the bus, even if it goes off a cliff? Like, what do you do with that?
You can definitely drive. I'm laughing because I'm also thinking of, when we do research sessions that are 60 minutes long, if I let the other participants just lead the way, we might never get the answers that we're looking for.
Yeah, exactly.
So yes, you can definitely guide the conversation. Part of, making sure that you're not just kind of ping-ponging at the surface and going all over the place, part of it goes back to some of those encouraging questions that I was mentioning earlier, where if there is an area that you want to go deeper on, that's the thing that you say, oh, say more about that, right? You can let the other stuff go, right? But you pinpoint that and say, that's where I'm going to go a little bit deeper. So part of it is that. I think the other part, and I think this is a little bit, sometimes we feel uncomfortable redirecting, but it can be really valuable. Part of it is acknowledging what the other person has said and then redirecting. So, especially in, let's say, a meeting or a business setting where you have a set amount of time, you need to, come to some sort of agreement or align on next steps, afford to just be all over the place, open-ended. And so if someone is taking you off track, you can say, like, that's a really interesting perspective. I want to come back to XYZ now, or thanks for your input there. What do other people have to say about this topic, right? And so I think the sort of like finesse there is you're not ignoring someone in conversation. You're saying, okay, it's interesting that you feel X, or I hear your perspective, right? You're giving them some way of saying like, yes, I hear you. I'm not ignoring you. And here's where we need to go.
Right. Right. How do you end a conversation? How do you know when a conversation's over? Because, your book made me ask a lot of questions. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I probably cut that off too early. Or it's like, wow, that's a dead horse. Like we could have left that a while ago. Are there any clues for like, okay, we're finished here? Other than, hey, we're out of time, right? Which is some meetings. But if you've just got a natural open conversation in life or in leadership, when do you know it's kind of coming to a close?
Part of that is when you start to hear repetition, either in language or, the same idea being repeated multiple ways. That's a sign that you've probably covered this ground already. It's kind of an interesting sign because it tells you that the other person thinks something is unfinished. And so maybe you have to figure out what that is, right? There might be something there, or maybe they are just a verbal processor and like they're just going to keep going there, and it's fine for you to say, I think we've kind of covered everything we needed to tackle. Let's try and pause here. And why don't you come back to me with next step after you've thought, through that more, since we've talked about it already, basically. Right. So repetition is definitely one to keep an eye out for.
Yeah. And, I'm glad that you talked about all the other things before you started to go into conflict, because the books on conversation often are around conflict and how to have good conflict. So I think a lot of people have training in that. But what are your tips on hard or conflicted conversations for people?
I think there's things that you can do at the beginning of the conversation, before, during, after. So, it depends on the topic, but I would at least think about it sequentially of like, what do I need to do to prepare? What do I need to do during? And what potentially do I need to do afterwards? One of the things I think that you can do to prepare, especially if there's some sort of power dynamic in play, like let's say it's a leader and their direct report, something like that, is to do what you can to reframe the conversation that's going to come, so that it's less tense and conflict filled already, right? It could just be a performance review, right? Where it's just, there is a power dynamic there. But so if you're in that case, then, as the leader, you can try to even things out by modeling vulnerability. And that's saying things like, when I was in your experience, like I had that challenge too. Or just reminding yourself that like, what does it feel like when your boss evaluates you? Oh, you get a little nervous? Okay, I'm going to try and be extra kind with like my person today because I know what that feels like, right? And if you're on the other side of that, then I think reframing, how you think of that other person, less in terms of title, which I think we can all get hung up on, and more as they're a person, right? This is not me having a one-on-one with the CEO who I'm super intimidated by. This is me having a one-on-one with someone who happens to be a CEO, but is a human first. And so therefore has flaws, and just like me, right? So I think that's part of it. I think also at the beginning of a conversation, setting an intention of, and I mean for yourself, but also with the other person, and saying, hey, this might get a little uncomfortable, this conversation that we're going to have. I want you to know that my intention isn't to push or prod. My intention is really to understand you. And so that's what we're here for, right? And so having that shared intention, I think, can also diffuse some of that tension of like, ooh, what am I getting myself into? And then the last thing that I'll mention during the conversation is I think that it's really helpful to know what are your personal, I call them hotspots. So what are those sensitive areas that you are likely to be activated by? Some of those are really obvious. Some of those are like, we feel super strongly about politics or religion or whatever it may be, and hard conversation with this person because we don't see eye to eye. Some of those are not obvious at all. And it's like, talking about our parents, or talking about like, oh, we're having a first day of school moment and we moved around a lot as a kid, right? So it's being aware of those and then recognizing in the moment, like, oh, you know what? I'm feeling a little bit of tightness in my throat, or my heart is starting to race, or I'm actually sweating a little bit. Like I'm feeling uncomfortable, and recognizing that in the moment so that you can say, I think I'm getting a little bit, I'm actually having trouble hearing you because I'm having an emotional response to what's being said right now. Can we take a break? Is it okay if we take a break? That I think is something that you can share, particularly if you have a strong relationship. If you don't have a strong relationship, maybe you're noticing it and you just say, I think I could use a water break, or should we do a bio break, right? Like most people are not going to be like, no, you cannot take a 2-minute restroom break, right? They're going to be like, oh yeah, of course, right? And so you can at least get that break to recenter yourself, or to say, you know what, I realize that like this is too much for me right now. I need to hit pause and let's come back to it.
The other thing I thought was so helpful in your framework is you talk about we all have natural limits. We are not robots, right? And there are some leaders listening who have 8 hours of meetings a day, or 4 meetings in a row, that kind of thing, where it's people. What is the role of rest, recovery, and relaxation in the role of great listening?
It's so, so important. And I think culturally, for many reasons, we don't really pay that much attention to rest and relaxation. But it's really important, because if you charge through and if you say, you know what, I'm tired, but I've got 4 more one-on-ones today and I just need to crush them. I need to get through them and then go home. What's probably going to happen is they're not going to be very good one-on-ones, because you're really tired. And realistically, you're kind of only half there. You're getting a fraction of what's being said and what's not being said. And as a leader, your time is really precious. So you kind of can't afford to be half there and get half of the data, half of the information during these conversations. So it's really important to know your limits, to know about yourself. You know what? I can do 3 back-to-back one-on-ones and then I'm toast. And then I need a break. Or I can do 4 and then I'm done, but it's important to know what those limits are so that you can be intentional and thoughtful about how you design your day, because it's going to make you a much better listener and more effective in that relationship. On the other hand, I know that there are people who are listening who are going to be like, yeah, but I don't control my day.
Right. What would you say to them? It's like, I'm in, meetings, and by 4:00, I have toothpicks in my eyes. I can't even see anymore.
Yeah. And I totally get that. I do think if that's your situation, part of it is finding ways to micro rest. So you're not taking that you don't have 3 hours in the middle of the day where you're doing your deep work and what have you, but you can take 2 minutes in between one-on-ones for yourself. That is a thing that you can do. Just take 2 minutes, do some deep breathing, close your eyes, listen to something calming. Remind yourself that everything you heard in the previous one-on-one, that's where it belongs. You don't have to carry it into the next one-on-one, and, try and start fresh. Those micro moments of rest, it's not ideal, but that can help you get through those periods and help you be more effective in the moment.
Yeah, it's such practical advice. I find the older I get and the more I know myself, the more I realize, well, I have real limits. I have 2 podcasts in me a day at the most, because this takes a lot of energy to really listen, be engaged, not just thinking about my next question. So after this one, I'm going to have a big old nap, and then I'll have some food, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Ximena, this has been so helpful. Anything else you want to share? It is a great book. It's the best book on listening I've ever read. It's long too. It's not a 50-page read. So if you want to really study this, and I was telling you, I interviewed Greg McKeown from Essentialism and Effortless, and he says listening is a superpower, that it can 10x your influence. So I couldn't agree more. And we're all in a culture where very few people feel heard. So anything else you want to share with us as we wrap up today?
I think the only thing that I would add is just, I think a lot of people think about listening as a skill that you either have it or you don't. Someone is naturally a good listener or not. And I really want to debunk that and say that there are tactical things that you can do to improve your listening skills. And that the number one thing, if you take nothing else away from this conversation, the number one thing I would say is building self-awareness about yourself as a listener and what stops you from listening, whether those are distractions or topics or people that you find it harder to listen to, that's worth paying attention to. And that's really step one for starting to reclaim and rebuild these.
Wow. Well, tell us about the book and where people can find you.
Yeah, so the book is called Listen Like You Mean It, and it's available on my website, which is kind of my hub. So if you want to follow me on social and my newsletter and all that good stuff, and that's XimenaVengoechea.com.
And we'll link to everything in the show notes. Ximena, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.